Okay, welcome everyone to the eRequesting Technical Design Group meeting for 29th of January 2026. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we all gather today. We pay our respects to our elders past and present and extend our respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We acknowledge the First Peoples as the first scientists, educators and healers. Okay, agenda for today. So we've got our usual business. We've got a couple of meeting minutes to approve from the last two meetings, some updates on other items. Then I'm just going to go through the ballot for working standard update again, where we're up to, which is the pointy end. We're getting very close, ready for publication. So today we've got to do that publication review prior to submitting a publication request to the fire work group. So we're going to go through the things we need to do that, just to finalise release one. And then the rest of the meeting we can spend talking about R2 scope. I think we might get Andy to talk to some of his scope items in that, but really an open discussion talking about what's next as far as release two looks at. We'll go through that Confluence page that we've set up for that. So these times are rough. We'll see how long it takes us to get through the publication review, but then we've got as much time left in the meetings we like to talk about things in R2. So moving on. Meeting minutes. So we've got 2 meeting minutes to approve this year because they hadn't been sent out before. I sent both of these meeting minutes out, I think, last Thursday to TDG. So we've got our meeting from the 12th of December last year and our first meeting this year, 15th. And I will just put these in the chat. You can have a look if you like. That seems like ages ago now, that meeting from last year. We've got our recording, we've got the minutes, as well as the decisions that were made during that meeting. And then we've got our other meeting that was, oh, sorry, that was the one from January. That was the meeting. No, that was December. And have I put the wrong link in? Looks like I have there. This is the correct one. Which one did I have there? Let's delete that one. Put the right one in. Okay. So that was the 15th of January meeting. And the other one was the 12th of December. All right. So we have complete minutes for that. There's no comments or actions on any of these. Does anyone need any more time to have a look at them or know of any issues with either of these? Otherwise, I'm open to a motion to accept both of these minutes.
Happy to move that.
Okay.
Approve those minutes.
So we've got a motion to approve both of these minutes. Would anyone like to second that?
I'll second.
Thanks, Andy. Watch poll. Approval of previous minutes. So this is for both of those minutes. Watch that. We've got one. I'll close that chat now. So we have 7 plus 1 in the chat, so 8 affirmative, 0 negative, and 7 abstain. So that motion has passed. Moving on to other business, some updates. So the Spark Clinical Design Group and TDG Community Co-Design Workshops in Hobart in February, at the end of February. That event is now sold out. But if you have a ticket and you're not going to be able to attend anymore, can you please email sparked@csro.au to release your ticket? Because there is a wait list. We can then release tickets to those on the wait list. On the other side, if you'd like to go and haven't got a ticket, also email Sparked so you can go on that wait list. So if any tickets are released, you can grab them. But otherwise, that event is sold out. I don't think I have any other updates. Although, Andy, did you want to talk about the dates that we've got for Connectathon? I don't have a slide for it, but I think we've got some tentative dates or dates that just haven't released tickets yet for Connectathon.
Yep. Dates for the Connectathon in Sydney at the Swiss Hotel is the 11th and 12th of March. And on the Tuesday prior to that Wednesday, Thursday, which I think is the 10th of March, we are going to have some working group meetings, full day meetings to do a face-to-face, and that will include the fire working group, AU Core, and eRequesting. We're just finalising agendas for those. We're also going to run a session on the AU GOM and the work that's been done, where we're up to, where it's going, those kind of things as well. From an eRequesting perspective, I think we have two major things to talk about. One of them is any early implementation experience with the eRequesting spec. I know Angus has been building off it, and I have been looking at migrating the Magenta's work across to the eRequesting spec. And I think because both of us have also extended that work into some additional areas, we are finding some constraints that we'd probably like to talk through. And all good. Australian Healthcare Expo in Sydney. Okay. Oh, well, that's unfortunate. I'll pass it on to Nady. So that's one topic I think we want to talk about. And the second one is to begin discussions around scope and timing for release 2. I would encourage anyone who has any R2 scope favorites that they put them into the section. I don't know if someone can grab it, the reference into the Confluence section that lists the topics. That would be certainly a core starting point. Down.
Yeah, discussions. Here we go.
That'll be part of that discussion. There's also Michael at the bottom has put in some of the things that we deferred in the R1 work, and whether if any of those are important to you, could you maybe add them into the table above so that we know that there is issues that you would like to progress around those topics. If you have any questions about the Connectathon or the working group meeting that day before, feel free to email me or any of the co-chairs, and they could probably put you onto the right path. If there are any questions, throw them into chat and I'll answer them as we go.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, moving on to ballot for working standard update. You've seen these slides before. We've been sitting here now for a while. We're at 100%. So we've done all of our ballot triage reconciliation and have applied all the changes. We are in the publication process now. We have a Oh, I didn't update this slide. This slide is actually, we have more than 84% now. I will show you on the actual ballot page. On ballot reconciliation, we have eRequesting ballot reconciliation and ballot for working standard. And we have 91% approval now. So we have 41 affirmative. There's only 4 negatives remaining. There was 3 abstain and 11 no votes, but that gives us a 91% for our pass. We only needed 60% to pass, so we're well and truly there. So that's awesome. So now we're just working through that publication process, which we'll do some more of today. So this is where we are in the publication process. So we're at this prepare release branch part now. We've completed all the changes. We've prepared a release branch. We're going to go through some of the items in that release branch today and make sure the TDG is happy with it. Then we'll do an approval request to the fire work group, which we will plan to take to the next fire work group to get them to approve publication, and then it will be published. And that publication, this check client's public specification and announce, all happens quickly. So once we're prepped, once we've got fire work group approval, we should see it published really quickly after that. It's all the work we've done beforehand to prep that gets us ready for publication. So that's where we are now. So today's meeting, we're going to review some things in the publication branch, the QA report, the standard level and the variance statement. Then if we're happy with all of that, we will request approval from the fire work group at their next meeting, which is on the 11th of February. And then all things going well, it should publish the next day on the 12th of February. So looking at publication, 12th of February. Vince?
Hi there. I was wondering where in this process there's going to be some statement around the fact that it's actually not legal to use this in a pathology laboratory at present. I mean, the legal requirement is the NPAC guidelines, and which state you have to use HL7V2, ADRM. I mean, this, and I haven't even seen that the firework is being taken through the NPAC process. Perhaps it is, and I just haven't seen it. But at the moment, if a laboratory used this and there was a concern or a patient raised an issue, there wouldn't be a legal leg to stand on because the NPAC requirements don't mention this at all.
Can I pick that one up?
Sure.
Hi, Vince, David. I'm sorry, my camera doesn't work. Now it is. So, Vince, I'll seek some clarification on that as well, because in the NPAC, my understanding is it says, or the latest requirement. So I think where there are changes it's allowed for under NPAC, but I'd like to go back and confirm that if that's all right, and I'll come back to this group and with some advice.
It says on the latest version.
Or the latest version.
This standard is not a later version of ADRM.
Yeah, so as I say, let me go back and have a conversation. I'll come back to this group because it's not the first time this has been raised. The last time it was raised, I wasn't here. Probably time for me to clarify.
Yeah, that would be useful. I mean, we want to encourage people to use it.
Of course.
But they need to understand that, they need to put appropriate messages around it saying, this is trial, this is, not yet NPAC approved, etc.
Yeah. And I absolutely agree with you. I mean, it would be remiss of us to not encourage use, but by the same token, it would also be remiss to have labs fail accreditation on the basis that they were using V2. So let me come back to this group if that's all right.
Yeah, I'm not even so much concerned about accreditation as I am about legal liability. Anyway, that's that the accreditation is an issue.
Whichever. I'll try and get some advice.
Yeah,
well, thanks, David. You'll note an action item for that. Okay. So yeah, they're the dates we're looking for publication. Moving on. Right, so what we're going to do, first part of this meeting now is that review. So there is a publication branch that is ready to go. You'll notice here, this is version 1.00. So this is the staging branch ready for publication. I'll put it in the chat if you want to have a look at it. So this is the kind of the publication ready branch. This is what will be taken through to publication. So this is the one we're going to just review some parts of today. Some of our requirements for publication is that we need to ensure that our AU variance statement is correct. We are also going to review the standard level that we've applied to the spec, and we're going to do a QA report review, which is reviewing the errors, warnings, and other messages on the IG. So we're going to work through each of those. First one is we're just going to review the variance statement. So in that build branch, we have a AU variance statement. This is a requirement for all Australian HL7 AU IGs. You'll notice that there is a link here to the H7 Australia Fire Work Group AU variance requirements. This is a PDF document. And this talks about the requirements of what we need to document in the IG about variance. The key things in this to note are that, I'll jump in here, that fire implementation guides should use AU core profiles, and fire implementation guides should use AU base profiles and extensions. So they're the two sort of key requirements to meet. And then we've got to document our variance. And basically this document also talks about what is a variance versus what's not a variance. So here we have the types of variance, whether there's relaxed cardinality, expanding terminology, in required bindings, removal of must supports, relaxed invariance, altering missing or suppressed data rules, or adding alternate extensions. And then it also describes what things are not considered variants, about further constraining cardinality, increasing terminology binding strength, adding terms to extensible value sets, constraining bound value sets, adding use of fire standard extensions, and adding must support. So there are requirements for HL7 Australia to document our variants. So looking back at our variance page, which is under AU variance. So this is our statement for this spec. We're saying that this implementation guide has no variance. It's fully compliant with AU-based fire implementation guide version 6, which is the current. But what we have done in addition to AU base is we have further profiled additional profiles that are not in AU base. So they're all our communication request profiles, the consent, document reference, task, and extension, and these extensions for display sequence and fasting preconditions. So they're not in AU base, they're things we've done above and beyond base. And then we've got another variant statement here about AU core. So we have no variants, we're fully compliant with AU core version 2, which has just been released. But we have done additional profiles, communication request, consent, coverage, document reference, service request, task, and extension. So that's just a statement there that we believe we are fully compliant, conformant with no variants from AU base or core. And I think you'll see that in everything we've done with all of our profiles, we've always derived from an AU core or an AU base profile with the work we're doing to make sure that we don't have that variance. Anyone got any questions about that? Or any? Just wanted to make sure we went through that today and make sure we're happy with it. It's been there the whole time. This hasn't actually changed since our ballot snapshot. So just reaffirming that we're happy with that variance. Okay. Next thing is looking at our standard level review. So up until now, the IG has been at draft level. So that's stating that it's not considered to be complete enough or sufficiently reviewed to be safe for implementation. I do like there's a comment in here somewhere too. Content at this level should only be implemented by the brave or desperate and is very much use at your own risk. So I think we've moved beyond desperate. What we're moving to now is trial use. So this content has been well reviewed and is considered by the author to be ready for use in production systems, has been subject to ballot and approved as an official standard. However, it has not yet seen widespread use in production across the full spectrum of environments it is intended to be used in. In some cases, there may be documented known issues that require implementation experience to determine appropriate resolutions for. Future versions of FIRE may make significant changes to trial use content that are not compatible with previous published content. So that's where we're moving from a draft. So what we've done too is all of our artifacts have now moved to a maturity level of 1. So that's things we've gone through the TDG that we've said that our artifacts are no longer at draft 0 level. They have moved to maturity level 1. So that is the bottom rung of trial use is level 1. But in order to publish a trial use spec, we do need everything at level 1, which we have done, and we will move to that. So you'll actually have if you notice on the in this publication branch, find it, you'll see on the home page here. So we're proposing now that this moves to trial use. Everything's already at level 1. You'll notice all our other artifacts also have this. We have a look at communication request, trial use, maturity level 1. So looking to move all of those to 1. So any questions about that before I move on to the next one as well? Okay. We'll move to the next part of the review. So the next thing we need to do for publication is go through the QA report. So we've been through this a number of times in the past. We do it when we do our Australian Fire Maturity Models, maturity assessments, those AFMM levels, and we have reviewed and accepted a number of these before. So there's a few new ones in this particular build for publication. So we've got 1 error, 1 warning, and 4 information. Previously, the TDGs accepted 7 warnings and 2 information. So only planning on going through really the ones that are new that we haven't reviewed before, but we can look at any others while we're there as well. So looking at the QA report, and normally Jamie would do this, but she's unable to attend today, so I'm going to stumble through it. So go easy on me. All right. Slide. All right. Close on. So to view the QA report, you just go down to the bottom of the IG. In the footer down here, there is a link to the QA report, which I'll put in the chat for you if you want to follow along. This gives you information about the build, shows you all the dependencies and some other information about it. But then here we have the errors and warnings against all of our artifacts. Now, what we've done here is in this build branch is suppress those warnings and information message. So we only get errors show up. Everything else has been suppressed. You can see everything else here is a 0. There are no warnings there, but what we'll do is go down and look through each of those suppressed ones and make sure that we're comfortable with them and accept them through the TDG. So this is a bit very low-level technical IG authoring type stuff, but it's something we need to do, make sure we're comfortable with. So These are the suppressed message. So this is what we've done. Jamie's made it easier for us by actually tagging some of these. So saying this is new. It's not something TDG has looked at before, but then's also provided information here. Has it been accepted for other work groups in Australia? And in this case, this error, it's new for us, not something we've looked at before. It's actually been accepted by the fire work group and AU Core Technical Design group. So they've already reviewed it because they're getting the same issue, and they've accepted it. So this particular error is that there's no definition could be found for this URL with the extension parameters. So this is a tooling issue. It's planned to be fixed in a later version of the publisher. There is a Zulip chat about this. So it's here, put in the chat as well if you care. But it's a known tooling issue. It will be fixed at some point. There's nothing we can do about it. It's not eRequesting specific. It applies across a whole heap of IGs. So that's one that we need to accept now because there's nothing we can do about it. It's outside our control. There's a number of information messages here. So this next one, we've already reviewed and accepted that one. And another information message here. This one has been accepted by a fire work group and AU Core TDG. These are known fire standard and extension pack, future version and current depreciation. So this talks about some of the things that are depreciated and are deprecated in future versions, and they're just information messages. So there are a lot of noise in this, so we're just suppressing those. The next one is a information message that's inherited from IPS. This talks about reference to a trial use value set that's within IPS. It's just we reference the pregnancy status and it's set to trial use. So that's managed by IPS, not something that we manage. It's not something we need to worry about. There's another one here which we've previously accepted. Then there's this one here. This is the big one. This is about the use of the obligation extension. So all those obligations we have in there, they generate multiple slicing information messages in the snapshot. So it's used across everything. So you see this information message everywhere. It also occurs in other IGs, IPS, IPA. They show the same error or same information message. And again, this one's been accepted by the AU Core TDG, saying the same thing. So anyone using the obligation extension is saying this message. So it's not causing any problems. It's just an information message. Next one is some fire standard reference code systems are published as draft or experimental only. Again, it's just an information message, but task code, request status, task status, and our ABS data. Some is experimental, others are draft. Again, just an information message. That one we've already accepted. That one we've already accepted. This one here, we actually inherit these warnings. So these are inherited from AU base. These warnings are on AU base. And they've already been accepted by the AU Core TDG. So this is because AU base is not pinning the version of the standard fire extension sourced from the fire extension pack. So there's a whole heap of warnings on those. But yeah, they're AU base warnings that we inherit. There's another warning there that we've already accepted. That one we've already accepted. And previously accepted. Okay, so that was it. So basically, we've had a look at those. There's nothing, the IG authors have been through this in great depth. There's nothing here that is any concern to publication. It's really just we get a whole heap of information warning messages when we do a build. This is going through them to make sure that there is nothing we need to worry about, but there is nothing that's come up there. that is of concern. Anyone got any questions about any of those? The key thing out of this will be that we will then have the QA report that looks like this in it, which basically says, well, there's nothing in here that's unexpected that went on. We don't suppress the error, it's still there. Like I said, that's the known one as part of the tooling. But otherwise it goes, there's nothing unexpected here. So what would happen, say we did another build now and some that we hadn't suppressed popped in, we'd start to see some numbers popping going in and go, well, they're new. What's that? Why did that happen? What did we do? How did that happen? So we're kind of starting from clean slate then to see, make sure nothing else new gets introduced. Okay, so we've been through those. We've been through that error warning and information messages.
Hey, Michael,
Yep.
can I just add a
Yeah.
comment?
Yeah, sure.
One of the challenges with suppressing the warnings especially is that you might introduce in the build, in your work, an additional instance of one of those warnings. So for instance, one of them, especially around like slicing, for instance, and not using a named slice. So you're using a numeric index for a slice. You can end up by suppressing it, hiding any new warnings that just happen to be the same kind as an existing suppressed one, where it is actually a real warning. So you just have to be wary of that, because I know it looks clean when you suppress everything and it's all kind of, we have none, aren't we great? The problem I find is by doing it, you may end up suppressing a whole class because of a realistic, known kind of acceptable issue in a particular kind of set. But if that set gets added to, you then lose potentially that additional warning.
Yeah, that's a good point. Wish Jamie was here to talk to it, but she's not. So, but yes, I think it is something to be aware of. I don't. I suppose the one you were talking about, yeah, was like the. Have a look at some of these.
Yeah,
The
when that one
slicing
about
ones.
yeah, the one this doesn't match any known
Yeah.
slice could
Yeah.
actually be because you've actually you've got an error and you haven't recognized an existing slice when you should have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll send a note to
Yeah.
Jamie. I don't have
Yeah.
any issues with the ones that are there. So
Yeah.
that's all good. But I think it's just one we have to be a bit careful in suppressing classes of errors.
Yeah, I think that's a
warnings.
good point. I think you could definitely yeah, just send Jamie a message so that we can just yeah.
I think it's important to note this is only in the publication branch. So now
yeah, good
we're
point.
back in the CI build, right? So all of those warnings and information items are no longer suppressed there. So if you really want to, you can sort of have your cake and eat it too a bit there.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll just bring that up. So this is the CI build. You'll see them all in here. Right. So it is only the publication branch that this has been done on. So if you're taking the latest from the CI build, you'll see it as it is. So basically shows that we were happy that we understood everything that was in this at the time of publication. But yeah, day to day, continuous integration, we see them all in here. Okay. So we've done that review that we need to in order to take this to the fire work group for publication approval. So we've done our variance statement review. We've reviewed the standard level, moved it to STU. We've done our QA report review and accepting those issues. I don't know that we actually need to do this, but it's probably, I think, maybe a good idea if we held a vote just to say that, you know what, the TDG as a whole is happy with release 1 for publication as it is. I don't know we necessarily need to do it because the fire work group actually will provide the approval to publish. But I don't know if anyone's interested, we can have a motion now to accept this. Otherwise, we'll just note that we accepted it.
Vote negative. Do you have to stay on the project, Mike?
Yeah, that'll be interesting if we did get some negative votes. But we can just do a general, like, is there, maybe we can do it by exception, is, does anyone have any issues with us moving to publication requests now in the firework group in the next meeting? And silence means that you're happy. That's a good amount of silence. I won't leave it too long because someone will feel like they have to talk. Okay, well, with that, congratulations. We have got to the point for release 1 publication. So it's been a long time coming. We've actually made it through on time. So we were targeting February publication release. So we'll jump through the hoops of the next firework group just to get that publication approval in place. But then a day or two later, we should have the publication branch ready to go, and then we can start looking at R2. So well done, everyone. Everyone deserves a good pat in the back for that. It's been a great effort. So now we can talk about R2 and put that behind us. R1's done. And start talking about R2. So Andy mentioned before that we do have this Confluence page. I'll put it in the chat. And Andy, I was hoping to hand over to you to talk a little bit about this, given you've got a few up the top there, and maybe talk about what things that might be interesting that we might want to talk about in R2.
Yep, I can do that. I guess just can you? Oh no, I can probably do it.
Yeah, do you want to share?
Yeah, I just briefly. I will share.
Yeah, you might share.
God, sharing in Zoom.
Green button down the bottom.
You can all see that.
Yep.
I just before I get on to that that other kind of R2 stuff, I did just want to say that the eRequesting kind of issues are still open, and you're more than welcome to submit as there's that little link at the bottom of the spec to submit issues for eRequesting. As you see, I've kind of discovered a few. One of the, I think the challenges we want to walk with the eRequesting, given where it sits, is for many eRequesting, the spec is a stepping off point for additional kind of things that we haven't yet talked about in the eRequesting work, and to allow the existing eRequesting spec to be open enough to embrace kind of new innovations that will hopefully get some experience in use, and then we can take through the consensus process, HL7 Australia standards process, where we see their value. So you might also find some of those. So if you do play around with it, then please use that opportunity to stick some issues in there that we can progress as a group. Scope. Right. So,
Andy, can you just zoom in a little bit? It's quite small.
oh, yeah, I can do that. Is that better?
It's better for me. How about others?
Do you need it bigger? All right. So this is Michael kind of reorganized the pages a bit the other day. So this sits under eRequesting R2 discussion, under AU eRequesting TDG discussion. So we'll move that across to probably just call AU eRequesting discussion at some point going forward as the working group kind of takes off. But for those of you who have been around long enough, and I know some of you have, it is where we were a few years ago when we started the TDG originally. We all sat, I don't even know where it was. What I remember is being in a room and we went through a bit of a wrestling match to figure out what should we do with R1, what was kind of achievable in the time periods that we had, and how can we create that foundation. We're going to do a similar exercise now, or not today, but over the next couple of months to kind of balance how much we want to bite off, how important those things are, and the timing we want to associate it with it. There's no point thinking that we're going to do a huge amount of stuff and take 3 years to do it. We really, I think, need to look at something, some kind of future date that is going to continue the momentum that we've currently built. Just a kind of, I guess, a note on the AU requesting transitioning into a working group. At the moment, the working group will have one project, and that project will be requesting. There are other areas that I know are being looked at by industry, and eRequesting, I think, one day probably becomes more of an orders and observations kind of entity. And I think we don't necessarily need to be at the sophistication of an implementation guide to at least set up some other projects if there is interest under the what is now the eRequesting working group to maybe discuss and work through some of these other potential areas of work, which might start out with just a bit of a discussion, but there might be a point at which we want to begin to document this in an IG going forward. So in my mind, kind of some of these are around things like reporting, both pathology, Vince.
Yeah, just on the reporting thing, I mean, there's already quite advanced work at Data7 International on the reporting, and I mean, calling the working group the requesting working group, I think that's going to need to get changed sort of pretty soon. Could we just call it the pathology working group? Or
Probably not pathology, maybe diagnostics, but
Diagnostics.
okay, diagnostics.
That is, yeah, that's, I think, something we need to talk about. The only reason we and do think of eRequesting working group as a holding pattern, the group should decide what they want to do and what the scope they want to embrace. If it is going to, say, include reporting, it might also include referral, more general referral in fire. And absolutely, there is work in international, there's work in different jurisdictions around this, and we need to kind of figure out where we want to go with respect to those existing pieces of work and what we see as our kind of scope for that. But I guess that's a discussion, hopefully when we get together face to face and can talk about scope, not just for the project, which is eRequesting for R2, but also I think more generally the scope of the working group itself. And there's no point kicking off areas of work unless there is people who are willing to contribute and to kind of move those things forward. So that is something we should talk about, and obviously making sure that those approaches are able to work with the existing specs that we have, namely eRequesting.
Yeah. I think it's important to try and get the Australian community engaged in that international work on pathology reporting as soon as we can, because I mean, I'm engage with that, but it needs a wider audience. And I'm not quite sure how we achieve that, whether that's by widening the scope of the working group or having a special group that looks at that. But it's moving rapidly to be a normative standard, and we haven't really had the opportunity to have much in the way of Australian industry and general input into it.
Angus?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment, Vince. I made the same comment about the name, but I agree with not changing yet. I think it's a part of like moving this group to the working group. We didn't want to confuse people with, did this thing end and something else over there start? So we kind of just wanted to keep the name for the transition across, but we're well aware that once we're across, the name change probably has to occur. And I, like you, I'm already doing fire result work already. So I too want to get to that space.
I've seen you there. Yeah, maybe eRequesting and diagnostics as a working group name. Anyway, we can think about that a bit more, but I think making it a little wider would be great.
Yeah, and I guess the other reason that we didn't jump is that we wanted the group itself to decide that rather than someone telling them this is what you're going to do. So yeah, we'll certainly talk about that and talk about the how we want to kind of interplay with the other jurisdictions and international around that. Someone else have a comment? No. So these R2 scope for the eRequesting is, I think, really driven by the current spec and what we ended up with and what we didn't end up with, and things that are of interest. I guess everyone's aware that the use of these kind of approaches is well underway in production, and through that work, we have discovered kind of opportunities for additional work that has been really driven by value in both placer world and the filler. The patient perspective is, I think, emerging on this, but I put the first three in there to kind of start the ball rolling, and I'll just briefly go through these three. Then we can talk about the data group stuff for adverse reactions, problems, implants. So one of the challenges that we recognized early on is that the requesting as it exists has obviously a policy setting of patient choice built in to the way diagnostic services are linked between the original kind of placer patient agreement on which diagnostic provider, if any, are wanting to be used, and then ultimately the patient is always able to make their own choice, for better or worse. And in doing so, we wanted to ensure that there was a way of giving a digital experience no matter where the patient chose to go. And between Sonic and Magentis and ACL are doing it in pathology, and we know radiology, we've talked to them about doing it as well, but in effect it's if a patient arrives with a token, then any diagnostic service provider should be able to use that token to gain access to the digital request and in effect have a similar experience to one which was originally directed to them. It would also allow the original recipient of the request to be informed that the patient has chosen an alternative provider, and in doing so, they probably have a bit more information than they might have had today in a paper world. I think it's fair to say that claiming is probably the wrong term for this. because as soon as you talk about claiming to a clinician, they immediately think MBS claims. So we struggle with the word a bit, but I think here the intent is to be able to access a request that is only accessible by you because you have somehow gone through that patient choice process. This, Angus will pipe up, but it has created some challenges. The challenges, I think, putting aside the policy setting or the whether you like undirected or directed, one of the implications of this is that if you have what I would deem kind of a late binding of the provision of the service to that patient, you don't end up with a fully fledged and accessible workflow leading up to that point. So in the case of something like radiology, then the process that the patient goes through to book, for instance, the service, that booking process is akin to the patient choice. But you can, because digital requesting is not ubiquitous, you're still going to end up in the situation where you might have a whole paper experience with your request, which actually is a whole parallel universe to your digital experience. So we can't necessarily give back to the ordering clinician insight into the journey and the choices that the patient is making on the delivery of the service. And that is a value proposition, I think, for the digital e-requesting world. The e-requesting using version 2 traditionally was done much more directed, and once that provider was chosen, it kind of was within that provider's universe and never really necessarily move out of it. This claiming approach gives more openness to the transfer of digital content. So we got it working. It does what it says on the box, kind of. But I think it's certainly time that this was discussed nationally and that we came up with a kind of an open way of doing this, and especially with the with an ability to work with the existing spec. It does mean more obligation on the part of the service provider to manage the access and openness of the requesting data. So that's something which will make some more interesting complexities around obligations of roles and the access control that's associated with data. Does anyone have any questions? I guess, have you got anything you want to say about the claiming stuff?
Only to the point you kind of made, which is it's in the wild, right? So it's being done on top of the spec we've already done, at least Sonic, Magentis, and we went live with against it, ACL, was it?
Yeah, ACL done it.
So two of the providers and Magentis are already doing a sharing architecture on top of the fire specs we've already built. So it's kind of we're lagging behind the actual industry implementation of it. So to me, that's one reason why claiming should be high. And it's kind of the utopian thing that we all wanted, that we can move requests across the labs by the patient's desire. So yeah, I guess that's why for me it's kind of number one, because if we don't do it now, just would be, the opportunity's there. It's being done, it's been proven, it's in the wild. So we should standardize it.
Vince?
I just wonder if we need a different term than claim, because as you say, whenever you say claim, a lot of the people will think we're talking about, Medicare and insurance. I think that's going to be very confusing for everyone. I just wonder if a different term would be better. one doesn't immediately spring to mind, but I think
Request fluidity.
transfer, splitting even, maybe that's part of the process. But I think that's going to be really confusing for people. So yeah, definitely I think needs to be given to that.
Yeah, I completely agree and happy to take suggestions. I guess the other aspect of this is also what does this mean in pathology and what does it mean in radiology? So one of the things that we've discovered in imaging and radiology is that uh, we're running into a lot of partial claiming in radiology. So you'll end up with a request that has X-ray and MRI, and one service provider can do the X-ray, they can't do the MRI. So the patient goes into the provider wants to claim the X-ray, doesn't want to claim the MRI. So if they claim the whole thing, they would reject the MRI part of the service request, and we would then need to allow for there to be multiple parallel fulfillments that could be associated with a request, and that's kind of something to think about with the thing that is not to be called claiming. Michael.
Oh yeah, just on all of that, I was thinking that we have in the current release 1 IG a set of use cases. Now we haven't implemented all of those for release 1. I think as part of this, it would probably be timely to review those use cases and incorporate some of these new features that we want. So as in targeting, well, claiming and booking and those sorts of things about how they would work in eRequesting as part of the use cases. Because again, how we slice and dice this would tie back to those use cases we're trying to implement.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think I'd forgotten completely about them. So thanks for reminding. We do need to, I think, when we're talking about that R2 scope, we need to reconcile what we want to do with those use cases because they should have a relationship to that, whatever we choose for the scope.
Yeah, and I think they need a review. There were things that were done, like you said, a very, very long time ago. And there's mentions in there about tokens and all these kind of things. So I think there would be, there's definitely, they need a review as part of R2, and that's when we can incorporate the new stuff. And probably on this too, like claiming whether, how far you go, whether you get into barcodes and things like that as part of that as well, or leave that out of claiming, because, you get into that complexity we've touched on before as well.
Yeah. Vince?
Yeah, and that issue of putting claims is already happening in pathology a lot. And I see it principally in the areas where people are sending stuff out to reference laboratories, and also there's a lot of histopathology referral going on from labs that don't do their own histopathology. And the issue with that for Medicare is that the first in best dressed gets the initiation fee, and the other lab misses out. So there's a bit of a contention there. But at least they can both claim against Medicare and against the health funds for the different parts of the request. So that's already a very common scenario.
Yeah, I've had some discussions with the department around the work that we do. What are those? What enablers could we actually be thinking about going forward to, it's not my position to tell anyone how these policy settings should potentially change, but she said we're going to have much more information about this. In R1, we did, I think, step away from sendaways, and we did kind of through, I guess, the labs themselves of driving this kind of thing of saying, don't you worry about a thing. We will get the order. We'll solve it for you. Whereas certainly with imaging, there seems to be, because it is a much more diverse sector, there are those kind of approaches are less common. So what was acceptable and kind of could be hidden within the pathology sector is not necessarily the same in imaging. So maybe revisit those discussions. I don't know whether we wanted to get into modeling sendaways and interlab stuff. Angus, you probably have a comment on that.
Yeah, just the last thing you said, like the claiming, the poorly named claiming that is happening today between ACL, Sonic, Magentis is front door request claiming. We haven't addressed sendaways, right? So it's not doing sendaways. I'm not saying it's out of scope. I'm just saying it's not implemented in a sendaway scenario anywhere at this stage. And whether that's in scope is kind of what I'm raising. So when we talk about claiming, at least in my mind, it was about, you know, the original request moving from provider to provider. It wasn't necessarily about this provider has accepted the request, but that HIV test they're going to send to the state lab, send away. We haven't delved into it being used in that way heavily, and maybe that's part of the scope as well. But that's a big scope question. Is that part of what we mean when we're talking about this poorly named claiming?
Yeah, I kind of agree that obviously the thing that we've got with the request is we have the whole order and the pieces that make it up. I would have thought the government would be interested in, you know, where there are Medicare claims being made, that they would actually see both the portion that is being claimed and the context in which it kind of lives, which, but those kind of things are big kind of political policy kind of questions. So we kind of try to push that aside in some ways. But in imaging, because we're kind of heavily into both pathology and imaging requesting, the imaging, it's not a issue of the imaging service takes on the whole of the request, the whole order, and then kind of does their own version of sendaways. It's not common as it is in pathology. So yeah, I think that's one of the areas we need that discussion around.
I guess what you're talking about with radiology is more like splitting. They take the original request and they split it. They say, I'm going to do this bit and I'm not going to do that bit. Where sendaways is the lab says, I'm going to do this whole thing, but in the back of my lab, I'm actually going to ask some other lab to do that component and then do it. Sort of different. But I can, with a stretch, I can sort of see that you could take the same fire requesting model we have for front door requests and just apply it between labs, right? Like it's sort of like, yes, I've accepted this, you know, you're doing this loop to get the request from the provider, but then you could just do the same standard, but you're now doing a send away, you know, between labs, possibly.
It also means we would need to figure out what does it actually mean in terms of things like group fulfillment status when you're splitting the group. And those things, they just become more exciting and complex to kind of manage as an implementation. Any other comments on the thing that shall not be named claiming? I think we'll just call it Vince. Next one. So booking. Booking is, I think, a core value add that sits obviously within particularly a large portion of imaging services. There is some booking in pathology, but how could we better support that rather than taking on the whole scheduling service? Someone has suggested to us that it would be possible to have booking information as an output of task fulfillment. So on the one hand, task fulfillment output is often the report. It doesn't have to be limited to a single kind of piece of the workflow. You can actually register outputs from any stage in that workflow. So certainly possible that we could have a filler, for instance, if there is a booking made, that they document the slot in the output of a task as part of the data that is created. And that, I guess, kind of also links into reporting. And it was always the intention in terms of fire that something like a report would be referenced via the fulfillment task, so that you could, in effect, bind the request and the report directly together in the same data network. And if you've got the request, you've watched its task, you've created the task, it's been fulfilled, you've seen the completion, and then you would see that a diagnosis report was referenced as an output of it, then you could, in theory, go and access that. But I think there is also an opportunity for booking information to be part of the value add and the experience as well. So certainly possible to do that. So I think it's pretty simple, to be honest, to do. So probably a lot easier than the previous one.
Andy, I think you've noted there that that's so the places where, but there's a lot of value there for the patient too. If they've got that
absolutely.
booking information available to remember when they booked. So.
Yeah, great point. Yes. That is a great point. And especially if we begin to kind of extend this work, the basic, kind of workflow into referral, then obviously, wouldn't it be wonderful if the patient could see in a calendar view of all of their diagnostics, all of their referrals in a calendar that shows, these things have all been booked, this is what's coming up, and even highlight to them, you really should book this for the things that don't have those associated bookings.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the point you've made there about we're just trying to allow the booking information to be available. So it's there. I mean, that's when, industry can then add value here now. The information is there, it's not. How do we expose it? How do we show a patient? How do we show places and that? So, allows for innovation.
Yeah, and these are probably some examples, and some of the issues that I've raised are really where, because of the scope we had in R1, we locked down some approaches to the things that made sense in R1. And one of the ones that bites me is the task, that tasks are actually quite ubiquitous. And while we've concentrated tasks on a couple of uses, once we start looking at reporting, for instance, we actually want to wrap the receipt and processing of a report potentially in a task as well. So by opening up some of those fundamental resource profiles that we've created to be more innovation focused in terms of extension and for other uses, that's I think one of those things. I don't think we locked and said anything about output. I can't recall, but I don't think we did any
No,
profiling.
I don't think we did at all. No.
Yeah, but certainly output, and obviously these three last in this list here around those additional data groups. I mean, these are all part of supporting info slices that we can add into the specification. These are quite incremental, I think, and there will be a growing set of these that are clinically useful. So we are certainly seeing a lot of clinicians asking us to allow for clinical history or particular requests to be added in. All right, I'm actually going to ask Vince to just give us a kind of brief précis on specimen, and maybe just an outline of where he sees specimen fitting into the puzzle and why it's an important issue for us to deal with. Is that okay, Vince?
That's okay. Yep. So the issue with specimen is that it makes it difficult to have a terminology that's not pre-coordinated with the specimen. At the moment, we have quite a few pre-coordinated terms, but if you want to order a sodium on acidic fluid or on an aspirate from bronchoscopy, you can't do that because you can't specify the specimen. So the laboratory instruments, in particular the analyzers, it can't be automated how they would then analyze that particular specimen. So the specimen is important in that situation for a number of reasons. Firstly, how it gets analysed. Secondly, how you set the normal range for it. The normal range for sodium in acidic fluid is quite different from the normal range for sodium in other fluids, like CSF. So it's really important from that point of view. If you don't, and it means that the laboratory has to, at some point, assign an appropriate specimen for the reporting to be done correctly. Also, at the point of reception at the pathology laboratory, one of the first steps that they do is check that they have the specimens that are relevant for the requested tests. Now, if the specimen list has already been provided as part of the order, because, say, the doctor's taken the specimens or the patient has self-collected the specimens, then it makes that checking much easier. Otherwise, they've got to look at, what things have been ordered, what possible specimens those things could have been done on, and then whether they have the appropriate set of specimens that's actually been received. So that brings, that's sort of two things. Is the set of specimens that have been received complete? Are they all the specimens that were collected? And are they sufficient in terms of being able to actually do the requested set of tests? Now, if the specimen was recorded at the point of order, it would be possible to at least automate the process of checking whether the requested tests can be done on the specimens that are being asked for. It would also mean that if you request a sodium, let's say you're requesting a sugar on saliva and on acidic fluid. At the moment, there's no way that you can do that because we don't have pre-coordinated terms for those two things. So without a specimen there, you just order a blood sugar, rather a glucose, and you wouldn't be able to specify which specimen you actually wanted that performed on, or specimens. So it's a significant limitation, and certainly in the laboratories where I work, the specimen becomes really critical. There's a validation that everything's complete when it's received, right through to analysis, and then to setting normal ranges and generating a report. So without a specimen, once you get to more complicated pathology, it gets, you just can't use it.
And is the answer not more pre-coordinated codes?
You would have to have millions of pre-coordinated codes. I mean, you can order a sodium on any bodily fluid. I can come up with 20 or 30 different bodily fluids if you like. You could also order a glucose on them. You could order a potassium. You could order a bicarbonate. You could order a pH. The number of pre-coordinated codes would absolutely, increase exponentially.
True.
Because the number of combinations that you can have of specimen and analyte is huge. It's why most systems that I've ever worked with support specimens. And if you look at the international systems, Oracle, etc., they all support specimens.
We wouldn't be able to control what specimen for what test, would we? Like someone would order a full blood count on urine, right? Which would be wrong, but we don't.
You really could. You can. I mean, certainly in my software, we do.
Maybe that's a bad example. Maybe liver functions on feces.
Yeah, and yes, you can have a set of what tests can be done on what specimens, and if someone asks for something that's different to that, then you question them, like a beta HCG and it's a male patient. You can say, well, is that correct? And the answer is often no, but sometimes yes. So it does allow you to question the user at the time of the order, but it also does allow you to set firm no's. We don't do liver function tests on urine.
I think, I mean, I don't think anybody said, no, we don't want specimen. I just think it was too much work to get in to R1.
Yeah,
so I think that's why we're looking at it for R2. And there are some key use cases for specimen, particularly culture and sensitivity, and also histopathology and cytology, because you can do that on anything. So yeah, I totally agree with you, but I think we need to move on.
Yeah. No, I was just asked to talk about specimen. That was all. So, so I think it's very important for R2, because I think that without specimen, many laboratories will not be able to use the specification.
And it's quite separate, like what they wanted the specimen to be and what the specimens are, isn't it? Like there's
Yes.
we survive with this today without it today because you physically have the specimens. And I agree there's this problem of like I want to do creatinine on this urine, not creatinine on that blood, even though I ordered a liver function as well. Like, it's unsure now, like what did you want the creatinine on? I can see that problem. But the problem of like analyzers and reference ranges, at the end of the day, that's what the lab has decided to do this test on what specimen, not what they requested. Like there's almost a gate, isn't there? Like the doctor is requesting for this test to be done on this specimen, but that's has to be validated and reassessed by the lab is doing this test on this specimen.
Sure. And there may be some automated mapping or whatever, but depending on what the list of specimens is that people can choose from at the point of requesting.
Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. It has to be considered and put in.
The other
I'm not
thing,
sure that it is such a huge amount of work, in that there's already quite a lot of work that's being done with that in V2, and there's well established tables of specimen types and so on that can be leveraged.
I wonder whether, obviously in the R1, we chose community diagnostic requesting as opposed to hospital based, and whether that specimen process becomes more complex, obviously biting into hospital specimen.
It's more complex, but it's just the same in the community. I mean, in community, you can, collect specimens that are blood, urine, because GPs collect specimens, blood, urine, feces, saliva. There's a whole range of them. And you want to order a blood sugar on some of those, you can't do it because there's no terminology to do it. And we're rapidly moving into the situation where people are going to be self-collecting, whether that's going to be hair or that's going to be saliva or it's going to be cervical cytology. We're going to see more and more self-collected specimens, I believe. So that's going to make the whole landscape complex, even for community, in terms of specimen types.
So it clashes up against the lab's preferred specimen for a test, right? Like the conflict between the way the specimen the lab catalog. The lab will say, "Oh, we require this tube to do that test," right? And recording that's very hard, and that's kind of where it's different in hospitals, right? They lock in that. When this test is ordered, we're going to collect these specimens, and they lock that into their ordering process, as opposed to communities more, I don't know, flexible or dynamic, where people are making human decisions about, oh, you want this test, and I'm going to collect this specimen to do it. Not all the time, but that's kind of like the default.
Sure.
The default is like
providing some guidance for people as to what specimen to collect for a particular test in the community would probably be helpful. Certainly, there are potential mechanisms for doing that.
Yeah, that's what I worry about, is trying to corral the industry into some sort of agreement that what specimen is required for what test is going to be difficult.
I don't think it's going to be industry-wide. I think it's going to be laboratory specific, and that you'll need to access that at the laboratory.
And how much of that is actually in the API versus how much of it does sit as business logic that sits outside of the IG? For instance, they're going to provide at least the mechanisms for whatever you want to overlay in terms of intelligent process.
Is where I see it sort of like it's recording a request, right? The doctor has requested to do this test on this specimen. That's nice. And then there's kind of this gate. What is the lab actually going to do? And because the lab's manual says we want this specimen for that test, and so there's always has to be open that yes, we know that's what you wanted to do, but this is what we did. You know?
What my software does is when you ask, for a particular analyte, it gives you a list of the potential specimens that analyte can be performed on by that specific laboratory, and you choose one.
Yes, and that's what I fear, right? Like, is that where we're going? Are we going to now make it so dynamic that when you pick Sonic and you pick this test, we're going to load up the appropriate samples as per Sonic for that test? Are we going in that space? Because that's as hard as the catalog problem we're already trying to challenge, right? That's multiplying up on the catalog problem. Or is it just going to be free form where the doctor orders this test off the Sonic catalog and chooses to say that I'm collecting this specimen out of any possible specimen he could? Like maybe it's feces, which would be wrong, but that's what he's chosen, as opposed to it being a curated list from the lab of the allowed specimens for that test. That's going to be hard.
That's getting into that whole kind of curated requesting. Like if you want this kind of request, then this is the clinical history you need to include. We're going to get into, we're not going to define all that, but I think, we obviously need a mechanism to carry clinical history within the request. I think likewise, we can argue we need to carry the specimen information in the request. And how much do we need to actually make inroads into this without, and then allow, because we don't constrain those service requests to not reference a specimen. I mean, you can do it now. We just have no guidance and no consistency in how you would ever do it. So I think this is a valid kind of obviously scope kind of opportunity that we need to talk about. In the last few minutes, I just wanted to kind of obviously the three data groups, they all make complete sense for particular requests where some need to carry those. I don't have any issue with those. I'd probably add in that medications as well. Which is not there. Happy to see that go through is supporting information kind of slices. I would say that I think we made the recommendation that all of these supporting information artifacts should have a narrative so that those who don't process structured content can still clinically, in a clinical safe way, always allow to extract narrative from any supporting information to do something manual with it. So I think, I don't know, I get a feeling like I'd like to see that hardened up in R2, but I think there's a couple more people might want to add into that data mix into supporting information. I would encourage you to go through some of these other deferred items because they might be important to you. Some of them you might find we kind of potentially support in kind of a some way, but is not at the level that you require. Like we did, for instance, with bundles, we've talked over the last couple of years about, becoming more specific about what a order bundle would look like and obligations so we can get more structure to it. We say little about the use of contained resources, for instance, any of that kind of stuff. It's certainly going to make life a lot easier for implementers if this is more consistent and as expected rather than requiring systems to support all possible options. So do feel free to add those in. Yeah, anyone's got anything additional they want to put on the table now? Otherwise, add them in here as you see fit, and they will become part of our scope conversation going forward.
Yep. Thanks, Andy. I might, Andy, add to this. I'll add another query in the bottom of this, which is the backlog, which is like the ones you're adding into Jira now. Will show up in here as well. So we've kind of got any new issues that are coming up that can go on discussion as well. Last couple of minutes, we just need to talk about next meetings. So this is what the forward calendar looks like. So now we've got our publication branch ready to go. We'll take that to Fire Work Group meeting on the 11th of February. It's in about 2 weeks. Hopefully, all going well, that gets approved in that meeting, and then look to publish. We should hopefully have it published the day after the 12th of February. So 12th of February is also slated as a TDG day. We've got the Spark CDG and Core TDG design workshops in Hobart on the 25th and 26th of February. That overlaps with our regular eRequesting TDG on the 26th of February. And then the one after that, we have a TDG on the 12th of March, but that overlaps with the Connectathon on that date as well. So just looking for what meetings we want to have coming up and any agenda items that we want for those, given that one will be published. Do we look to have the next one and continue scope discussions and then cancel the next two, given the overlaps, or open to any thoughts anyone has on what meetings we do have and what we plan to go through? Well, I think everyone's quiet. How about I did have a poll that I'll see if I can launch. Yeah, I can't see it.
Is there a missing box on this at the beginning, Andy, for the scope discussion on the 10th?
Oh, I'll put it down here. The 10th, March 10th is the work group meeting day. So
so it's February, March. Sorry, I was confusing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm confusing March and February. Yep, sorry.
All right, well, let's focus on the next. Is everyone happy to continue with the next meeting, continue scope discussions in the next meeting? Anyone think we don't need to? We need a break? No. Okay. Well, we can firm it up in that one, but we can hold the next meeting, or we can report then that hopefully release one is published. And if Andy, you're happy to continue scope discussions in that next one?
Yeah, I guess it's all that dependent upon people actually putting some ideas in there. I'm also happy to go through talk about any of the issues that at least I'm finding. I think Angus will kind of might have a few that he wants to kind of chat about as well. So can certainly do that.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll continue with that one. I think given the overlap, and we'll have limited attendance, the next two would be cancelled, but then that would be looking at the March 10 work group meeting days, what Andy talked to us about, having an eRequest session on that on the day before the Connectathon in Sydney to further refine some of the scope stuff for R2. So thanks, everyone. We'll see you at the next one.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, everyone.